one more question because I think we've run out of time. But this is your reference to reading Gramsci through Foucault, Foucault through Gramsci. As that being one of the important distinctions between. Can you expand on that a little bit? Sort of, it's an interesting idea.
I'm not sure how well I can expand on it. I mean, I just kind of use it as a sort of marker in the sense that what passes as cultural studies in the United States of America, I find extraordinary. I mean, it's not anything that I recognise. It has no sense, a lot of it has no sense of history, it has very little sociological input, it's very rarely empirically based. I mean, this sort of, the designation, this term cultural studies and who's going to kind of own it, as it were, seems to be a sort of an issue, and clearly an important issue for people in all kinds of ways, intellectually, in terms of career prospects. There are many things at stake for many people, but this animal, cultural studies, and a particular kind of transformation it seems to have undergone, certainly in the passage of some part of it between Britain and the USA, is very curious. And I suppose, I spent some years in the mid-80s only partially involved in academic work, so I was actually running a publishing house most of the time. And in publishing terms, what's extremely interesting is that, of course, is that theory, very abstract theory, is the most exportable product. Yeah, the publishing I was interested in doing with the original Comedialist was very interventionist and very locally focused. We wanted to publish things that would make a difference to what happened in Britain. We had the kind of, at one point, I mean, it was a bit mad. At one point, we had the production schedule for books down to 12 weeks. And we were producing things that, a year later in another country, were useless. It was very much publication for use. And maybe that was a kind of utopian project in a sense. But I suppose what I find really striking is the extent to which the kind of high theoretical redefinition of cultural studies really has to be seen to some extent as an effect of the economic logic of the publishing industry, which will always push you towards abstraction because you've got a bigger market. It travels better. Theory is export industry.
Well, especially in I guess you're right, in the American media. But I thought you might simply talk about the whole discussion or discourse about the body. I mean, oftentimes, that's a big thing right now, where how the body is controlled, how the body is sort of. That's the sort of the Foucauldian stuff that I thought that.
Well, you see, I mean, for me, I don't actually think Foucault is as interesting as either de Certeau or Bourdieu on that. If I want to think about how the body is controlled, for instance, in relation to some of the issues I've been trying to research, then Bourdieu's 1972 published piece on the Berber household, to me, is kind of actually more useful, it has proved, than anything I've found yet in Foucault. That analysis of the gendered organisation of domestic space and the way in which that affects and determines, in some respects, the utilisation of domestic objects, I think is an admirable model of, as it were, the organisation of bodies in space. I think de Certeau's conception of institutional space and the way in which one has to distinguish between, tactics and strategies and so on, and the invasion and poaching of space, generalised as it is, at least begins to give you a model of, as well, crucially, a spatial model. And I think, rather than the body, I think for me it's that kind of spatial question which I am increasingly interested in. And in Britain, I'm just delighted to discover, increasingly within the discipline of geography, there are people who are actually doing extremely interesting things in that area. I mean, when I was at school, geography was something where you learnt how many tons of pig iron they made in Frankfurt or something. It's like kind of really mindless stuff. But following, I suppose, crucially from the work of people like Manuel Castells at an earlier point, in the theorisation of urban space, there's beginning to be, for instance, in the work of people like Kevin Robbins at Newcastle University, I think a very, very interesting set of developments, which are to do with not just, as it were, the policing or surveillance or control of the body, but of social space, and which takes that spatial phenomenon seriously, that spatial dimension seriously. And for me, I suppose, to return to some of those questions about spatiality and also about temporality, whether we're talking about the institution of national standard time or the articulation of domestic time and national time or whatever else, those questions, I think, are the ones I'm most interested to follow so far as I can.